Okay, so this is like a there are a few things that I'd like to talk about section 3.13, which is not really discussed in your textbook, right? But this is like an extra material, right? So this is like a extra material that, your textbook really did not cover this, but there are a couple of things that I'd like to, cover based on what you have learned about the R, right? From our another textbook, right? The book of R, right? Okay, so now let's just read this data one more time. Okay, so let's just I'm gonna copy and then let's just paste. Okay, so you know that this is the CSV file, right? Read CSV file, and this is gonna return the data frame, right? Okay, and I'd like to see like this column, for example. Let's see. Where is that? Yeah, like for example, like read news, right? Yes and yes and y, and there's empty and y, right? So for example, right? So if you just want to print what? Let's see the like for example, read news, right? So let's just, if you run this, we know that it's yes, 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 and then there's empty space, right? And then yes and yn, right? So you know that this is what? This is perfect, this is the right candidate, right, for the factor, right? So it's better to make it, sometimes, I think this is a one good candidate, right, for the, for a factor, right? But at this point, it's just what? This is just a vector, right? And there's a couple of ways you can make this as a factor, right? And so based on what we learned, right? Based on what we learned, we can what? There's okay. First, right? The best way is you replace this empty, slot, right? This empty, right? With NA, right? Not available, right? So the best way is when you read, right? When you first read the CSV file, you can just add one more option. It's called NA string, right? Not available string. And then that string is equal to, it's a null. It's not a null. It's just, square two quote, right? Two double quotes. Basically this, right? Then, so let's just copy and then paste. Now you will see the difference. Okay. So now let's just run this. Okay, you know that now is what this empty, right? This empty string is replaced by NA, thanks to this option, right? Now, if you want to make this as a factor, right? At this point, right? You can make the factor, right? For example, let's say I have to create another variable. Let's say read news dot factor, right? So this is just variable name, and then I can use a factor function, right? Factor, right? And then what? I'm gonna use this, right? This is my variable, right? Since I'm gonna make this as a factor, right? And then my levels, I have to provide the levels, right? It's a vector of what? Yes and no, right? Because you see that there's only yes and no, right? So this is there are only two categories, yes or no, right? So yes, and then no, n, right? Good. So let's just run this and copy, paste. Okay, so now let's just run this. You know what? Yeah. So good. So this factor functions make this string vector as a factor, right? With this levels, right? You know that this and it's include NA, right? Okay, and then let's see. Right? So it's a level is yes or no, y or n. And you know the NA is not available, right? NA. Okay, good. There's another way. You need extra step, right? You need extra step to make this as a factor, right, by using this factor function, right? However, you don't have to really do this. I mean, you can, there's another way that basically we can add another option, to the read CSV functions. So copy and paste. Okay, so basically, NA string, right? And then you need another option is called strings, right? String as a factors. So this means the should character vectors be converted to the factors if you make this as a yes. Okay, so this is, you see this option quite often. Okay, string as a factors. And if you make this as a true, right, then this read news, I mean this chapter 3 data read news, it's the type of this variable, right? It's already, it's a factor, right? So you don't have to really use a factor function to convert, right? For the conversion, you don't have to really need to use a factor function. So I'll show you. Okay. So now let us, after we run this, and let's take a look at this, right? Okay. So let's just run this. Okay, and then let's see the read news. Okay, now this is what is a factor, right? So, without this string as a factor options, for example, right, this read news, the type, right, the class, okay, so let's just run this one more time. Run, right? And then, okay, so run this, and then run this news. And you know that when we look at the class, it's a character, it's a vector of the characters, right? So that's a vector of characters. This one, right? Basically, it's what? Vector of Ch3, right? But so that's why you need to have a factor function, right? If you want to make this as a factor, you have to, of course, you have to convert it to a factor using this factor function. However, in this case, when you make this set as a true, this is already a factor, right? So let's see, class, right? And then let's just copy and then paste, right? Oops. Chapter 3 data, class, right? Okay, and okay, so let's just run this one more time. Run, and run, right? So now it's a factor. So this is, please remember that this option is used quite often, okay? And I already mentioned this in my previous lecture in the part 1, right? You know that it's when you use the mean function, right? For example, make sure that you use if, for example, let's say this is like midterm score, right? Those midterm scores. So this is like a vector, let's say 100 and 98, some number, right? And then, let's say NA, right? It's not available somehow. Maybe, that students did not take the midterm, right? So let's say this is the number, right? And then if you want to calculate the mean, right? The scores, right? You know that it's whenever you want to use this mean functions on, if you apply this mean function to a vector which has this NA, right? You know that this will, yeah, its a return value is NA, right? So if you want to get rid of this, right, I told you that you need to use another option. It's called not available remove is true, right? So now you can say, okay, so let's just run this. Okay, so it calculate, right? It calculate the mean, or this apply for the mean and standard deviation and median functions, right? But anyway, you use these mathematical functions. This mathematical function is applied to a vector with NA. Make sure, please remember that you should include this option, NA RM is equal to true. Okay, good. So I'm done with the part 2, which is kind of extra material that I think you should know. And by the way, this lecture is based on my previous lectures, right? My lectures on the R, right? This material is from the book of R, our second textbook. Okay, thank you.